Hey everyone, this is Chris, and you're listening to One Cross Radio. And if you couldn't tell by that different intro, today's episode is going to be a little bit different than normal. And I didn't think that my normal cheery theme was fitting for the topic. Um, and in case you didn't read the title or see the thumbnail art, today we are talking about the sinking of the RMS Titanic. That sound at the beginning was actually a simulated distress signal from the Titanic in Morse code, and it is supposed to read SOS SOS CQD CQD. We are sinking fast. Passengers being put into boats. Um, why I'm doing an episode on Titanic, I'll be honest, I'm not 1,000% sure. It's aside from I've always been fascinated by the Titanic. Um, and I've done an episode about the movie with Mike because the movie is utterly fantastic. But there are some discrepancies from real life, as natural as naturally as there are in any adaptations. But it's something that I've always been interested in and fascinated by. It's one of those disasters that you can't say is a natural disaster. But it's also like not it's a non-intentional man-made disaster. Um, so let's kind of jump to it. Um, if hearing about death is something that bothers you or is an issue, I would advise skipping this episode as we are talking about a disaster where over 1,000 people perished. Um, so I want to put that disclaimer up there. We're looking at something dark today. Something fascinating but serious and tragic. So if that's something that is going to be upsetting to you or negatively impact you as much as you might enjoy the show, I love you. I don't want to cause a bad day for you. So if that can be upsetting for you, I'd encourage you to hop off here because we're going to get into it. So a little bit of background. On the sinking of the Titanic, I'm going to be throwing some numbers at you. At first, it's the total capacity um, of uh, of people on board. So the total was it's been approximated because I mean it's been over 100 like over 100 years at this point. The consensus seems to be either 3,327 or 3,547 according to other sources. Reported numbers specifically though seem to be um, 2,435 passengers and 892 crew members. Of that, um, of that amount, the 3327 or 3547, a total of 1,503 people did tragically pass away. 815 of whom were passengers and 688 of whom were crew. 63% of all passengers perished, 39% of the first class passengers perished, 58% of the second class passengers perished, and a whopping 76% of third class passengers perished with the sinking of the ship. 685, nope, sorry, 688 crew members perished. And yeah, sorry, I thought I had a different percentage, but it read the same thing. I actually have notes for this one because I'm like, no, this is serious, and I want to. This is. I was saying to Jill, this isn't an off the cuff one. So to give a little bit of background on this, further background on the sinking, what caused it? The common knowledge is they hit an iceberg. Um, per the British inquiry, and I'm going to be referring to the British inquiry a fair bit here. The loss of the ship was due to the collision with an iceberg brought about by the excessive speed at which the ship was being navigated. Despite ice warnings, the ship was going at 22 knots, which is just 2 knots shy of its maximum speed of 24. Titanic's high speed in waters where ice had been reported was later criticized by many as reckless. Um, but it reflected standard maritime practice at the time. According to Fifth Officer Harold Lowe, the custom at the time was to go ahead and depend on the lookouts in the crow's nest and watch on the bridge to pick up the ice in time to avoid hitting it. Um, North Atlantic liners at the time prioritized timekeeping above all other considerations, sticking rigidly to a schedule that would guarantee arrival at an advertised time. This will come into play later in a little bit of a myth I'm going to try to shoot down. They were frequently driven at close to their full speed, and they treated hazard warnings as advisories, not as something like, hey, you need to do this, like, hey, you might want to do this. They were looking at it as a guideline instead of a rule. It was also widely believed that ice posed very little risk. Close calls were not uncommon, and even head on collisions had not been disastrous. For example, in 1907, the SS Kronprinz Wilhelm, a German liner, had rammed an iceberg and suffered a crushed bow, but it was still able to complete her voyage. Um, so that would inform the attitude of it not slowing down, which hugely contributed to the sinking. Other factors were the crew really wasn't prepared for emergencies, as well as attitudes towards lifeboats at the time. So there were emergency drills canceled throughout the voyage that would have gone over. Um, how to safely load and disembark the lifeboats, how many people could be on the lifeboats, um, and clear instructions for evacuation protocol. Um, this led to a lot of confusion during the disaster, um, and impacted it greatly. But we're going to get more on that as we get into it. So now we're going to dive into the timeline. So the Titanic had set sail. I'm not doing it from the start of it, but I'm going from April 14th into the 15th, the day slash night of the collision until the sinking. Um, so 9 a.m. on April the 14th, 1912, um, they received their first ice warning from the Coronia. Now we're jumping 13 and a half hours later. So between 11:30 and 11:39. Uh, there's a description on the conditions, the sea conditions from a survivor, Colonel Archibald Gracie. He wrote that the sea was like glass, so smooth that the stars were clearly reflected. Although the air was clear, there was no moon, and with the sea so calm, there was nothing to give away the position of nearby icebergs. Had the sea been rougher, waves breaking against the icebergs would have made them more visible. Um, Also, there had been an unfortunate mix-up before the ship left dock, where the people in the crow's nest who were keeping a lookout didn't have binoculars. Now, it's also been stated due to the conditions and the time that this happened that the binoculars wouldn't really have helped much. So they were they were up a creek with this happening. Um, at 11:39. Um, Although the air was clear, sorry, I read that part. Uh, so that was between 11:30 and 11:39, and then they get the call: iceberg right ahead. So 11:40. Collision. There was the collision with the iceberg. Officer Murdoch attempted to maneuver around the iceberg, but the ship collided with the iceberg and had a glancing blow. An underwater part of the iceberg scraped along the starboard side of the ship for roughly 7 seconds. Up top, chunks of ice dislodged and fell onto the ship's forward decks. The iceberg scraping buckled the plating, popped rivets, and caused an opening in the hull, letting water in. Now, there's been a dispute by experts about the size. Some uh, some argue that it was roughly 12 square feet, but others have argued, and there's evidence for both. And I'm not an expert, so I'm just going to say what actual experts say, and I'm going to report both. Um, Others saying like this wasn't like one big spot or a couple smaller spots. This was one wide gash, about 300 feet in length and 10 feet above the keel. While the ship could reportedly stay afloat, if 4 out of its 16 watertight compartments were breached, the impact had affected 5 compartments, and the ship was done. Um, I think of that excellent scene in the film Titanic, where it's right before the DVD break, where you gotta pop in the second disc, um, where it's like she'll go back and back and back. There's no stopping it, um, and it's true. So, moving on. At 11:45 p.m., all engines are stopped, and the ship slowly drifts south. And crew, including engineer, the engineers, and Thomas Andrews, who helped build the ship, start the investigation to determine what the damage is and what they're looking at. Um, at 12:15 a.m., the stewards begin ordering passengers to put on the lifebelts and jackets. And this was an uphill battle. Everybody was looking at it at an inconvenience. They believed that this ship that was absolute luxury and been touted as like a pinnacle of engineering. And it was later described, people were saying, like, oh, it had been described as unsinkable. That quote was never actually true. They had thought there was the prevailing attitude that it is practically unsinkable. Attitudes at the time felt engineering had gotten ships beyond the point where they could be sunk by natural elements, but it wasn't ever described as, like, fully as unsinkable. Um, and as this time, they're also assessing things, figuring things out. So the passengers are like, what? We don't really need to do this. Come on, why have we stopped? Like, the ship will be fine. Now we're going to talk about the lifeboat situation, because in the timeline, the lifeboats are popping up in a second. Um, so, the lifeboat situation. I want to specifically explain it. So, the Titanic had a total of 20 lifeboats, comprising of 16 wooden boats and with 8 on either side of the ship, and 4 collapsible boats that also which had wooden bottoms and canvas sides. On average, the lifeboats could hold up to roughly 65 to 68 people each, and collectively they could accommodate 1,178 people, which is about barely half of the number of people on board, and a third of a number um, that the ship was licensed to carry. The ships were licensed to carry more lifeboats, but at the time they were licensed, but they were not required to have enough lifeboats to cover every single occupant on the ship. Uh, Part of that was the prevailing attitudes, like, nah, the ships aren't going to sink. Like, nah, we're good. Hubris, but there were attitudes at the time informing it. The track records at the time were informing this hubris. Was it wrong? Absolutely. But if you read about it and you don't look at it in hindsight, you can kind of understand how they got there. The also the way we look at lifeboats now is very different to how we look at lifeboats then. Because the attitude at the time as well was that in an emergency, lifeboats were intended to be used to transfer passengers off the distress ship to a nearby vessel. It wasn't like, hey, everybody get in a boat and sit here and wait for rescue. That happened after Titanic. Titanic, unfortunately, changed in a good way the attitude towards lifeboats. It's just terrible that that had to happen for that attitude to change. Um, it was commonplace for liners to have far fewer lifeboats than needed to accommodate all their passengers and their crew. And of the 39 British liners at the time that were over 10,000 feet, 33 had too few lifeboats in place to accommodate everybody on board. So it wasn't a Titanic White Star Line only issue, it was the prevailing attitude of 1912 and the years before. It wouldn't be until later that year, unfortunately, a couple days later, a couple months later, that they would change that. So that informs that. So at 12:20 a.m., lifeboats are beginning to be loaded. Now, this is where we touch on some of the confusion that I was talking about earlier. So there was confusion in how many people could be safely put in the boats. Some were lowered with like 12 people. Um, two of the earliest boats left with 28. Um, so there was also further confusion that led to how many people were in the boats over the women and children first rule. Um, there was a discrepancy on how it was understood. On one side, you had Murdoch, who understood it as women and children first, and then on the other side, Officer Light Toller had interpreted it as women and children only. He would because of that misunderstanding, he would lower boats with empty seats if there were no women and children waiting, while Murdoch would allow a limited number of men to board if all the nearby women and children had embarked. Um, they also, because they didn't know how many could be safely carried in the boats, especially as they were lowered, they both erred on the side of caution by not filling them to capacity. They could have been lowered quite safely with their full complement of 65 to 68 people, especially with the favorable sea conditions, because it was a very calm night. Had this been done, an additional 500 people could have been saved. But instead, because of the lack of understanding, the lack of proper training, and lack of clear communication beforehand, hundreds of people, hundreds of additional people, predominantly men, were left on board as lifeboats were launched with many vacant seats. 12:45, and this is the morning of April 15th. Wireless calls for assistance. First transmission using CQD is sent out. Transmission altered to the new code sorry, not first transmission using CQD. The first transmissions were using CQD. Then it was altered to feature the new SOS, and it was the first time a passenger liner had used this code. Um, Lifeboat 7 was ushered away um, at this point with 28 passengers. At 12:55, Lifeboat 6 was sent away from the other side, also with only 28 passengers. This one including the unsinkable Molly Brown, who had survived an accident on the Titanic's sister ship Olympic. Where it was struck by another boat but made it back, no injuries and no fatalities. But then she also was on the sister ship, the Britannic, which did sink, but she survived that as well. Unfortunately, with injuries, but she did survive and then earned this name. Molly also encouraged the crew to go back. Now, there was an issue with the crew as well, um, because sorry, Yeah, there were crewmen. Not enough crewmen were out and about. Some had been sent down to help other people. So some of the crew that could have manned the boats, um, they were also locked in the ship as she was sinking. So you had less experienced crew up there. You had people panicking. Um, it it wasn't a good show. Molly's whose real name is Margaret. Um, Molly's pushing for them to go back, and in the movie you can think of Kathy Bates saying, "Come on, there's plenty of room," and the person shooting her down might be slightly fictitious, but that is what happened. She pushed, and they didn't go back. Um, all right, so then we're jumping forward. To 1:20 a.m. At this point, water is seeping through the floor in boiler room number 4. Distress flares are firing, and the true seriousness of the situation is now becoming very apparent to everyone. Um, Now, I don't have a time for every single lifeboat. So here are just some of the stats that were going on with the other lifeboats. Um, the lifeboats were lowered every few minutes on each side of the ship, but most of the boats were greatly underfilled. Number 5 left with 41 aboard. Number 3 had 32. Number 8 left with 39. Number 1 had left with just a capacity of 12. The evacuation didn't go smoothly. Passengers suffered accidents and injuries as it progressed. One woman fell between lifeboat number 10 and the side of the ship, but someone caught her by the ankle and hauled her back onto the promenade deck. And then she made a successful attempt at boarding the lifeboat. Um, First class passenger Annie Stengel had several ribs broken when a German American doctor and his brother jumped into lifeboat number 5, squashing her and knocking her unconscious. The lifeboat's descent was otherwise risky. Number 6 was nearly flooded during the descent by water discharging from pumps out of the ship's side, but it successfully made its way from the ship. Number 3 came close to disaster as one of the davits jammed, threatening to pitch the passengers out of the lifeboat and into the sea. 137. Titanic's watertight compartments begin to fail, and the ship now begins to sink far faster than it had the preceding hour. 137 seems to be the time where everybody's like, dang, it accelerated. Uh, 140 is when uh, passenger John Stewart entered the first class smoking room. He saw Thomas Andrews staring at a painting of the Plymouth Harbor above the fireplace, his life jacket lying on a nearby table. He asked, "Aren't you going to try for it, Mr. Andrews?" Andrews didn't reply and apparently didn't even hear the question, and it seemed like he needed to gather his thoughts. You can, of course, think of again, excellent scene from Titanic where Rose and Jack go through the first class lounge and then find Mr. Andrews in there. Um, 2:05 a.m. The remaining leaving engineers leave the boiler rooms as nothing can be done. Nothing can be done to save the ship. They had been fighting. Some had been dying just to keep the ship running this whole time as it was sinking, just so it could have power, so they could get people off the boats, so they could shoot the rockets, so they could send out the distress signals. Uh, the engineering people are heroes. None of them, none of them made it. None of them. At 2:10, uh, the last transmission was sent. At 2:15, things really started to go haywire with the ship. This description is from the survivor Jack Thayer. Occasionally, there had been a muffled thud or deadened explosion within the ship. Now, without warning, she seemed to start forward, moving forward and into the water at an angle of about 15 degrees. This movement with the water rushing up towards us was accompanied by a rumbling roar mixed with more muffled explosions. It was like standing under a steel railway bridge while an express train passes overhead, mingled with the noise of a pressed steel factory and a wholesale breakage of china. At 2:17 a.m., the propellers were now completely out of the water, and the stern was starting to rise at a steady pace. An increasing roar. That was a weird. Sorry. An increasing roar was heard. I was reading roar. I saw was and heard, and it came out as horror. My apologies. Breaking the tension accidentally. An increasing roar was heard by those in the lifeboats, and it seemed as everything movable in the ship broke loose and crashed forwards against the walls and bunkheads. Gradually, the ship began to give up bit by bit, imploding, um, cracking, the breaking. The first half going and then the second half slowly going. At 2:20 a.m., Titanic foundered and sunk. Um, and then at 4 a.m., the Carpathia arrives and begins boarding survivors. Um, so we're gonna get to some of the stuff, some of the final things in a second. I do want to quickly say though, there is the wreck of the Titanic, but especially over the past 20, 30 years, um, there have been more and more visits to the wreck. The wreck was already deteriorating, but as more and more people have visited the wreck in submarines, and the submarines actually touch down on the wreck, it's speeding up deterioration. So the wreck is now rapidly deteriorating, and due to the many visits and other factors. I mean, it's been in the deep sea for over 100 years. Experts are now estimating that the wreck could be completely eroded by as early as 2030, which is a shame. Anyways, I also want to quickly address a few of the myths around the Titanic. Now, I'm not going to address all of them because that can and will be an episode of its own that I'm going to do down the line. But there are kind of two um, in particular that I wanted to talk about. Um, so one is about the fire. So it's a documented fact that a fire began in one of Titanic's coal bunkers approximately 10 days prior to the ship's departure and continued to burn several days into the voyage. Now, fires occurred frequently on board steamships due to the spontaneous combustion of coal. The fires had been extinguished by fire hoses and by moving the coal on top to another bunker and by removing the burning coal and feeding it into the furnace. The event of the fire has led to some experts and documentarians theorizing that the fire exacerbated the effects caused by the iceberg collision, and that the fire reduced structural integrity of the hull. And a critical a bulkhead, but an even larger number, and most experts have refuted this, and it was not by any inquiry found to be a leading factor. There's been numerous documentaries you can find on YouTube about like the real cause of Titanic sinking, and they talk about the fire. Did the fire have an impact on the ship? Absolutely. Was it the cause of the sinking? No. There are other myths around that and conspiracies about the thinking of the ship, but like I said, there'll be an episode down the line about further myths around Titanic. The one in particular, though, I wanted to address are many myths surrounding Bruce Ismay. Now, Ismay, J. Bruce Ismay, he was sorry, I'm just trying to find his title. At the time, he was an English businessman who served as the chairman and managing director of the White Star Line. He was the highest ranking official on the Titanic, and he survived the sinking. Um, Ismay has almost always in the portrayals afterwards been demonized and vilified. This was very much an American press thing. Ismay had had a falling out with sorry, I'm just trying to find the name. I had just had it. Um, Dang it! Yeah, give me a second. So Ismay had a falling out with uh, American uh, news publicist a businessman, newspaper publicist, and politician named William Randolph Hearst. And then Hearst never forgot the falling out because Ismay was a very, very private man. And Hearst didn't like that. And I'll try to go in on that episode later, but basically, Hearst then used this as a like the use this to really um, like go in at him. The journalism that was used to go in at Ismay was described as yellow, like not really based in fact. Instead, using eye-catching headlines for increased sales, something that is still happening today. Um, so it really went out like the American press really went out of their way to vilify Ismay, especially anything by William Hearst. um he was condemned in America, and where the Hearst syndicated press ran a vitriolic campaign against him, labeling him, amongst other things, J. Brute Ismay. Um, and then there was in one of the publications, it had an artistic rendering where it was a list of all those who died in one column, but then in the column of those it saved, it only had one name, Ismay's, which isn't true, but it's a hit piece. And journalists do that, media does that. This led to a lot of depictions of Ismay going forward as selfish, as a coward, as a jerk. In some depictions, he was even shown as a Nazi, um, a corrupt businessman. Um, in Cameron's film, he's also, of course, he's poorly depicted. The actor who played him and played him very well had also objected to his portrayal because there were scenes of Ismay's good deeds, which I'm about to get to, um, but they were cut for running time. And there's reports, although nothing I found with a quote, but enough that pointed to it where it's the justification of cutting those scenes along with runtime is like, well, it's what people were expecting. In the 2012 miniseries Titanic, they depicted Ismay as a bigot who orders a group of non-British crew members to be locked uh, below to drown. The 1958 A Night to Remember, which is a fantastic version of the Titanic story, but still not accurate. It didn't just blame Ismay for the disaster, but it also depicted him in a cowardly light. A depiction of the show Voyager on the show Voyagers showed Ismay dressing as a woman in order to sneak on to a lifeboat. This is contrary to what actually went on with Bruce Ismay. There is no evidence whatsoever that he actually pressured uh, Captain Edward Smith to maintain speeds or to set a record, because as the liner's MO at the time, they were maintaining advertised arrival times at all costs. There's no benefit whatsoever to being like, hey, let's arrive early. There's no benefit to that. Nothing, like no good benefit. Further, an experienced captain would not bend to an executive's whims easily. Further, that when they portray him as a coward in boarding with the lifeboats, Smith actively helped many women and children, potentially up to hundreds, board lifeboats before boarding one himself. He persuaded people. The dude was in his pajamas and slippers. He used his position as someone who is known to talk people who were nervous about leaving the luxury of the ship and the warmth of the ship. He talked them into getting on the lifeboats. The man saved lives, potentially hundreds of lives. As well, he was tossing things from the deck, chairs, luggage, anything that would float into the water to give people who were already in the water something to float on. And it was only when there were no other women and children around him and none in the area that he had boarded a lifeboat. Despite being villainized in the American media, he was found not guilty of anything in the British inquiry. The American inquiry was very much a hit piece on borderline everything. The British inquiry was fairly judgment free. They were looking for a cause. They weren't looking for a story. They weren't looking for a hero and a villain. They weren't looking for that kind of thing. They were just looking for what happened. So the British inquiry found him guilty of nothing. The official report noted that Ismay's work in rendering assistance to many passengers and didn't pass judgment on his decision to jump into the lifeboat. In fact, they're quoted as saying as, had he not jumped in, he would merely have added one more life, namely his own, to the number of those lost. And there's an excellent article that the link is in the description from historicuk.com by James Pitt. And I'm going to use this direct quote uh, for our boy Ismay as we wrap up. It is a popular belief that, hounded by the media and plagued with regret, that Ismay retreated into solitude and became a depressed recluse for the rest of his life. Although he was certainly harmed by the disaster, Ismay did not hide from reality. He donated a significant sum of uh, of his money to the pension fund for widows of the disaster, and instead of avoiding responsibility by stepping down as chairman from the White Star Line, he helped pay out the multitude of insurance claims by the victims' relatives. And the years following the sinking, Ismay and the insurance companies he was involved with paid out hundreds of thousands of pounds to the victims and relatives of the victims. I wanted to. I've always, as I've started to read more into Titanic over the years, I've always felt bad for Ismay. And as much as I enjoy the James Cameron film and the performance by the actor Jonathan Pryce, um, I still feel bad for Bruce Ismay. He's been single-handedly vilified and portrayed as like the reason when, as we've looked at, there's many reasons. The prevailing attitudes at the time being, in my opinion, the main thing. Now, of course, experience had dictated those, but still, if if trainings had been done, if things weren't looked at as guidelines and were treated as rules, this could have been avoided. But when you look at the attitudes at the time, you can see how it was a recipe for disaster, where if it wasn't the Titanic, it would have been something else. Um, and I've just kind of always felt bad for Ismay, and his portrayal is still one of those things where it's become known fact. Like, no, he saved lives. Like, in my opinion, the dude is unquestionably a hero. Um, for how he was reacting in the story, and others weren't. Um, but misinformation spread and still stands to this day. I have yet to see an accurate depiction of that man in any Titanic related media, and that's a shame. And to me, with this, May, it's a reminder of like, hey, when people are vilifying vilifying someone and it's accepted as common knowledge, it could be accurate. It very well could be accurate, but sometimes it's not, and it's worth looking into. Um, so I wanted to. That's where I'm going to end the episode. There will be a sequel episode of sorts down the line where I'm going to look at more myths around the Titanic. Uh, Captain Smith's behavior and his fate, near my God to thee, Officer Murdoch's fate, because these have been disputed. Uh, the dispute about the Carpathia and its lack of involvement, as well as some of the conspiracy theories surrounding the Titanic. Like a bomb or a deliberate switcheroo of ships, that it wasn't actually the Titanic, or the deliberate sinking. Um, Titanic is a fascinating story. It's tragic, but there's a lot to learn from it. There's personal things to learn. There's things to there's things we can see where a market improvement of societal stuff, i.e., what to do with lifeboats after the fact, as well as, hey, even though there's clear cut evidence of things, there's still springboarding of conspiracy theories, as well as hey, false depictions go a long way, even if facts disprove it. Anyways, I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I know it was a little more somber and different than what we normally do, but it's something that I've always been interested in, and I do like doing episodes that aren't always light. Yeah, so I hope you enjoyed today's episode. Let me know the comments and your thoughts. Let me know if you'd be interested in me covering other disasters at some point. I hope you enjoyed today's episode. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe. And again, if you want to check out more of my stuff, um, you can hit up the link tree that I'm linking in the comments, because that'll take you to my other podcast. If you want more Chris, you can, and my joke is why, but also thank you. You can check out Radio Arcade that I do with my boy Christian, as well as my infrequent wrestling podcast, Power Bombs and Pile Drivers. If you like the show and you enjoy what I do at all, please consider supporting me through Patreon. The link to Patreon is in on the link tree as well. Through there, you get bonus episodes, shout outs, early access, and a bunch. I hope you all have a wonderful day. Stay safe, take care, and God bless, my friends. Peace.